The park hummed with the quiet rhythm of a new day. A golden haze clung to the trees, their leaves dappled with sunlight that filtered through the branches. Joggers trotted along the winding paths, earbuds in, lost in their own worlds. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, its sharp yelp cutting through the soft murmur of conversation and birdsong. Senator Anthony Blake loved this time of day. Early mornings had always been his sanctuary, a moment to reflect before the whirlwind of meetings, calls, and decisions that defined his life. Today, he had extra reason to run. A contentious bill aimed at police accountability was on the Senate floor this week, and the pressure from both sides of the aisle weighed heavily on him. Running helped him think. It cleared his mind, allowed him to process the complexities of his role. He adjusted his pace, his steady breaths matching the rhythmic crunch of his sneakers against the gravel path. He wore a simple gray tracksuit, his senator's lapel pin still attached to the collar, an oversight he'd only realize later. To anyone watching, he was just another runner. Nearby, Officer Mark Stanton sat in his patrol car, parked strategically at the edge of the park. His shift had been uneventful, as most mornings were. A few noise complaints, a report of a missing dog, the usual humdrum of suburban patrol work. But Stanton was on edge. He'd been reprimanded last week for a minor infraction, and the sting of it hadn't worn off. His commanding officer had called him careless, unprofessional. Stanton's jaw tightened at the memory. He scanned the park idly, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Blake. Something about the man, his confident stride, the way he moved, felt out of place to Stanton. The park was in a well-to-do neighborhood, and while Stanton would never say it outright, he carried certain assumptions about who belonged here. Blake jogged past a playground, slowing momentarily to adjust his smartwatch. Stanton's hand moved reflexively to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got a suspicious individual near the east side of Fairview Park. Male, black, mid-40s, wearing a gray tracksuit. I'm going to approach." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy, Unit 12. Proceed with caution." Caution. Stanton's lips twisted into a faint smirk. He didn't think he needed to be cautious. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt as he walked. The weight of his badge and gun felt reassuring, a reminder of his authority. Blake noticed Stanton approaching but kept jogging, his pace steady. He didn't think much of it, cops patrolled the park often. But as Stanton stepped directly into his path, forcing him to stop, Blake's guard went up. "Morning," Stanton said, his tone clipped. "Morning," Blake replied, pulling out an earbud. "Something I can help you with?" Stanton's eyes scanned him, lingering on the senator's lapel pin for a fraction of a second before dismissing it. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Blake's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I'm jogging. Same as everyone else. Do you live around here?" Stanton's hand hovered near his radio, the question laced with an edge that made Blake's chest tighten. "I do. Is there a problem, officer?" Blake kept his tone measured, resisting the rising urge to challenge Stanton's assumptions outright. "Got some ID on you?" Stanton's voice hardened, a subtle challenge that hung in the air between them. Blake's jaw tightened. He had dealt with this before, the coded language, the implicit accusations. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his driver's license. Stanton examined the ID, his expression unreadable. He handed it back after a moment but didn't step aside. "You got anything else on you? Mind if I take a look?" "Take a look." Blake's voice sharpened. "I'm not sure what you think you're going to find, officer, but I've done nothing wrong. Am I free to go?" Stanton's eyes narrowed. "Not yet. Hands where I can see them." The moment hung heavy with tension. Around them, a few passers-by slowed, their gazes darting between the two men. Blake saw one of them pull out a phone, holding it up discreetly. He took a deep breath, raising his hands slightly. "Let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be," he said evenly. But Stanton had already made up his mind. Chapter 2, Suspicion Escalates. Senator Anthony Blake stood motionless, his hands raised just enough to signal compliance without conceding defeat. His mind raced, evaluating the situation. He was no stranger to systemic bias or moments like this, but each encounter carried its own sting. The park's tranquility had evaporated, replaced by the silent tension of eyes watching and judgment forming. Officer Stanton's radio crackled faintly, but he ignored it, focused entirely on Blake. "Turn around," Stanton ordered, his voice carrying an edge of authority that brooked no argument. "Turn around for what?" Blake asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I've complied with your request, handed over my ID, and explained what I'm doing here. On what grounds are you asking me to turn around?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Stanton snapped, his hand now resting on the holster of his taser. "Just do as I say." Blake's pulse quickened. He knew how easily these situations could spiral out of control, but the indignity of being treated like a criminal gnawed at him. He glanced around, catching the concerned gaze of a woman holding a stroller. Her phone was pointed directly at them now. "Good," he thought. "Let someone document this." "Officer," Blake began, carefully choosing his words, "you have my ID. You know who I am. I have explained myself fully. Now I'm asking you again, am I free to go?" Stanton hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he steeled himself. "Turn around," he repeated, his voice louder this time. "You're resisting an investigation. I'll place you under arrest if I have to." Blake exhaled sharply, lowering his hands to his sides. "An investigation into what?" he pressed. "Jogging while black. Because that's all I've done here. And I think you know it." The words hit Stanton like a slap. His jaw tightened, his grip on the taser growing firmer. "That's it," he muttered under his breath, reaching for the handcuffs clipped to his belt. Before Stanton could make his move, the woman with the stroller spoke up. "Officer, I'm recording this," she said loudly, her voice quivering with a mix of fear and determination. "This man hasn't done anything wrong." Stanton shot her a sharp look. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. This is a police matter." The woman didn't flinch. "This is a public park," she retorted. "And I'm not interfering. I'm just making sure everyone sees what's happening here." Blake felt a surge of gratitude and anger all at once. He turned back to Stanton, who now looked visibly agitated. "You're making a mistake," Blake said evenly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his position. "I'm Anthony Blake, state senator. I've done nothing wrong, and you're about to find yourself in a very precarious situation." For a moment, Stanton faltered. The name struck a chord, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "Senator or not, you're coming with me," he growled, snapping the handcuffs onto Blake's wrists with an audible click. The car pulled away, leaving behind a stunned group of onlookers, their murmurs filling the void left by the departing patrol car. One man leaned toward the woman with the stroller. "Did he just say he was a senator?" She nodded, her eyes still on the retreating vehicle. "Yeah. And that cop is about to find out what that means." A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd that had formed. Phones were raised, capturing every angle as Stanton led Blake toward his patrol car. The senator didn't resist, but his expression remained resolute, his head held high despite the humiliation. As Stanton opened the back door of the patrol car, Blake turned his head slightly. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, his tone steady but loaded with meaning. Stanton ignored him, slamming the door shut and walking around to the driver's side. His adrenaline was pumping now, clouding his judgment as he radioed in. "Unit 12 to dispatch. I have a suspect in custody. En route to the station." The voice on the other end was calm, almost disinterested. "Copy, Unit 12. Bring them in." The patrol car rattled down the road, its radio occasionally crackling with static and dispatch updates. Senator Anthony Blake sat rigidly in the back seat, the cool metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He stared straight ahead, his mind a swirling storm of emotions. Anger, humiliation, and a simmering resolve battled for dominance. He knew this moment would become bigger than just himself, but the immediate sting of indignity was difficult to suppress. Officer Mark Stanton glanced at the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. The senator's earlier words echoed in his head, "You have no idea what you've just done." Stanton dismissed them with a shake of his head, focusing instead on the familiar route to the station. To him, this was just another arrest, another box to check on his daily patrol log. The man in the back seat, senator or not, was just another person who had challenged his authority. Blake broke the silence. "You still have time to fix this, officer. All it takes is one phone call. You know who I am." Stanton let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think your title makes you untouchable? The law doesn't work that way." "No, officer. But accountability does," Blake replied, his tone calm but edged with steel. "And when this gets out, there's going to be plenty of it to go around." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. The station loomed ahead, a squat brick building that looked as tired as the officers who worked inside. Stanton pulled into the rear lot, parked the car, and stepped out. Opening the back door, he gestured for Blake to step out. "Let's go," Stanton said curtly. Blake complied, stepping carefully onto the pavement. He didn't stumble or falter, his composure a deliberate statement in itself. Stanton walked him through the side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where the public might see. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the gray walls. The booking area was sparsely populated, a sleepy desk officer leafing through paperwork and a young rookie fiddling with a coffee cup. Both looked up as Stanton entered with Blake in tow. The desk officer's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the man in cuffs. Mark," the desk officer said, lowering his papers. "Is that suspect brought in for resisting investigation?" Stanton interrupted briskly, steering Blake toward the desk. "Let's get him processed." Blake raised an eyebrow but remained silent as Stanton began filling out the intake form. The rookie, unable to contain his curiosity, whispered to the desk officer, who shot Stanton a concerned look. "Mark, you sure about this?" the desk officer asked carefully. "That's Senator Anthony Blake." Stanton's pen paused mid-signature, but he didn't look up. "I'm aware," he said through gritted teeth. "Doesn't change the fact that he refused to cooperate." The desk officer leaned back in his chair, skepticism etched across his face. "You ran his ID? Verified his story?" Stanton's pen paused mid-signature, but he didn't look up. "I'm aware," he said through gritted teeth. "Doesn't change the fact that he refused to cooperate." The desk officer leaned back in his chair, skepticism etched across his face. "You ran his ID? Verified his story?" Stanton's silence was answer enough. The rookie's eyes darted nervously between the two officers, the tension palpable. "Mark," the desk officer said, lowering his voice, "you might want to call the captain before this goes any further." Blake finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "I suggest you listen to your colleague. One phone call, Officer Stanton. That's all it takes." Stanton's frustration boiled over. Slamming the intake form onto the desk, he turned to Blake. "You think you can intimidate me with your title? You think you're above the law?" Blake met his gaze unflinchingly. "I think you're letting your pride cloud your judgment," he said evenly. "But by all means, proceed. The cameras are watching." The desk officer cleared his throat. "Mark, let's just—" "No," Stanton snapped. We're doing this by the book. Before anyone could respond, the door to the booking area swung open, and a senior officer stepped in. Captain Ramirez was a no-nonsense leader with a reputation for fairness, and the sight of her immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. "What's going on here?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. The desk officer stood. "Captain, this is Senator Anthony Blake." Officer Stanton brought him in on suspicion of resisting an investigation. Stanton interrupted. Ramirez's gaze snapped to Blake, her expression unreadable. "Senator Blake," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Is that correct?" Blake nodded, his composure intact. "It seems I've been mistaken for a criminal during my morning jog. I trust this will be rectified promptly." Ramirez's jaw tightened. She turned to Stanton. "Officer, step into my office. Now." Stanton hesitated but complied, leaving Blake with the desk officer and the rookie. As the door closed behind them, Blake leaned against the counter, his voice low but purposeful. "You might want to keep an eye on that one," he said to the desk officer. "Pride and prejudice are a dangerous combination in your line of work." The desk officer said nothing, his discomfort evident as the rookie stared at the closed door where Stanton and Ramirez had disappeared. The air in the room remained heavy with unspoken tension, the fallout of Stanton's actions just beginning to unfold. The office door slammed shut behind Officer Stanton, and the walls seemed to hum with the tension emanating from Captain Ramirez. She gestured sharply for him to sit, her gaze unrelenting as he complied. Stanton perched on the edge of the chair, his defiance barely masked beneath a veneer of professionalism. "Explain yourself," Ramirez demanded, leaning against her desk. "From the beginning." Stanton cleared his throat. "I was patrolling the park, and I noticed an individual who seemed out of place. Suspicious behavior. When I approached him, he became uncooperative. I followed procedure and brought him in." Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious behavior? What exactly did Senator Blake do to warrant your suspicion?" Stanton hesitated. "He was jogging. Adjusting his watch. It matched the description of." "Of what?" Ramirez interrupted, her voice sharp. "Did you run his ID? Confirm the description? Anything?" He refused to cooperate. Stanton shot back. "I didn't have time for." "Stop," Ramirez said, holding up a hand. "You didn't have time. Stanton, you handcuffed a state senator and brought him into this station without even verifying his identity or the supposed crime. Do you realize what you've done?" Stanton's face flushed red. "With all due respect, Captain, I was following protocol." "No," Ramirez snapped, her voice low but forceful. "You were following your pride. And now we're all going to deal with the fallout." She straightened, pacing behind her desk. "This is already public," she said. "There are videos, Stanton. By the time I walked in here, Dispatch was flooded with media inquiries. Do you understand the implications of this? Not just for you, but for this department." Stanton clenched his fists. "What was I supposed to do? Let him walk away?" "Yes." Ramirez shot back. "If there was no crime, yes. You let him walk away. You don't escalate situations because your ego tells you to. You think your badge gives you the right to profile anyone who doesn't fit your idea of normal. You think the rest of us are here to clean up your mess." The words hit Stanton like a blow. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his defiance had drained away. Ramirez sighed heavily, her anger tempered by weariness. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, fixing him with a steely gaze. "You're suspended, effective immediately. An internal investigation will determine the full extent of your actions, but make no mistake, Officer Stanton. This is not going to end well for you." Stanton opened his mouth to protest, but Ramirez cut him off. "Dismissed. Leave your badge and gun on my desk." He stared at her, his face pale, before slowly removing the items and placing them on the desk. Without another word, he left the office, the sound of the door closing behind him heavy with finality. In the booking area, Senator Blake remained calm, his hands resting loosely on the counter as he waited. The desk officer avoided eye contact, shuffling papers nervously, while the rookie glanced up at him with wide eyes. The tension was palpable. The door to Ramirez's office opened, and Stanton stormed out, his jaw tight and his steps quick as he exited the building. Moments later, Captain Ramirez appeared, her expression unreadable as she approached Blake. "Senator Blake," she said, her voice professional but tinged with regret. "On behalf of this department, I'd like to formally apologize for what happened here today. You're free to go. If there's anything we can do to make this right." Blake turned to face her fully, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Captain, I appreciate your apology," he said. "But what happened here isn't just about me. This is about a culture that allows officers like Stanton to act on prejudice and ego without accountability. An apology doesn't erase that." Ramirez nodded slowly, her face somber. "I understand, Senator. And I assure you, this will be addressed." Blake studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll hold you to that," he said before turning to leave. As he walked out into the bright morning sun, he noticed the crowd of reporters and protesters that had gathered outside. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in his direction as voices called out questions. Blake raised a hand for silence, his commanding presence enough to quiet the crowd. "I'll have more to say soon," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "For now, just know this, accountability is coming. Not just for today, but for the system that allows this to happen. Stay tuned." The crowd erupted in questions, but Blake didn't stop. He walked past them, his mind already on the next steps, the press conference, the legislative session, and the reforms that needed to happen. He would ensure this moment wasn't wasted. It wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been in his position and for those who would come after. Behind him, the cameras kept rolling, capturing the start of something much bigger than a single arrest. The press conference room at the state capitol was packed. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing intermittently as they adjusted their lenses. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, the weight of the morning's events drawing in media from across the state. In front of the podium, a blue curtain framed the space, and the state flag stood prominently to one side. Senator Anthony Blake's team had worked quickly to set this up, knowing the moment demanded a swift and decisive response. Behind the curtain, Blake stood with his chief of staff, Melissa Carter, reviewing his notes. Melissa's expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. Blake nodded. "This is bigger than me, Melissa. If I stay silent, I'm complicit." Melissa sighed, smoothing the papers in her hands. "Just, be careful. They're going to twist your words if you give them an opening." Blake smiled faintly. "I've faced worse. Let's do this." The aide stationed by the curtain gave him the signal, and Blake stepped forward to the podium. The chatter in the room died down as the cameras zoomed in, every lens trained on him. He scanned the crowd, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice calm but firm. "This morning, I had an experience that, sadly, is all too common for many Americans. While jogging in a public park, I was approached, detained, and arrested by an officer who assumed, without cause, that I posed a threat. My crime? Being present while black." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Blake continued, undeterred. "Let me be clear, this is not about one officer. This is not about me as an individual. This is about a system that allows implicit bias and unchecked authority to persist. Today, I am using my voice to speak for those who have been silenced, ignored, and mistreated by the very institutions meant to protect them. The cameras clicked furiously as Blake paused to let his words sink in. He leaned slightly forward, his tone growing more impassioned. We cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the systemic issues within our justice system. The time for half measures and platitudes is over. I am calling for a full investigation into the practices of our law enforcement agencies. I will also be introducing a bill aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing, including mandatory body cameras, independent review boards, and enhanced bias training for officers. The room erupted in questions, reporters shouting over one another to be heard. Blake raised a hand, silencing them. "I'll take your questions in a moment," he said. "But first, let me address something personal. This morning's incident was humiliating, but it was also clarifying. For years, I have worked on policy from the perspective of an advocate, a legislator, and a community leader. Today, I experienced firsthand what so many others endure daily. This fight isn't just political for me anymore. It's personal." He stepped back slightly, signaling that he was ready for questions. The room exploded again, and he pointed to a reporter near the front. "Senator Blake, do you believe the officer's actions were racially motivated?" Blake nodded, his expression serious. "I believe that implicit bias played a significant role in what happened today. The officer acted on an assumption rooted in prejudice, whether conscious or not. That's exactly why reform is so urgently needed." Another reporter shouted, "Do you plan to press charges against the officer?" Blake shook his head. "My focus is not on retribution but on systemic change. I'm not here to ruin one person's career. I'm here to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did." A third reporter asked, "How do you respond to critics who say you're using this incident to further your political agenda?" Blake's eyes hardened slightly. "I would say this: if advocating for accountability, fairness, and justice is considered political, then I am proud to stand on that platform. This is not about politics, it's about people." The questions continued, but Blake held his ground, answering each one with poise and clarity. By the time the press conference ended, the room was buzzing with energy, the reporters already composing headlines in their minds. As Blake stepped away from the podium, Melissa was waiting for him backstage. "You did good," she said, a note of relief in her voice. "This is just the beginning," Blake replied. And he meant it. This moment was the spark. Now it was time to light the fire. The backlash began before Senator Blake even left the press conference. As the media dissected his statements, social media erupted with a cacophony of reactions. Hashtags like #JusticeForBlake and #PoliceReformNow trended almost immediately, accompanied by clips of the press conference and the bystander videos from the park. But not all the responses were supportive. Blake's team had warned him about this. Controversy was inevitable. Still, as he sat in the back seat of his car, scrolling through his phone on the way back to his office, the vitriol in some comments stung. Typical politician, making everything about race. He's just grandstanding to push his liberal agenda. What about the officer's side of the story? Blake set the phone down with a sigh. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but the sheer polarization of the discourse was exhausting. Across from him, Melissa tapped on her tablet, compiling a list of media appearances and meetings. "We've got CNN at 6, and NPR wants an interview tomorrow morning," she said without looking up. "Also, your inbox is flooded with messages from advocacy groups and," she hesitated. "Death threats. Security is already handling it." Blake's expression hardened. "Death threats?" Melissa nodded grimly. "It's part of the territory, unfortunately. The good news is, the footage from the park has gone viral. Most of the public is on your side." Blake leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It shouldn't take viral footage for people to believe this happens," he muttered. Melissa's voice softened. "I know. But this is the reality we're working with. And you're making them listen. That matters." At the police department, Captain Ramirez faced her own storm. The media frenzy had put the department under a microscope, and city officials demanded immediate action. A hastily convened press briefing was held that afternoon, with Ramirez fielding questions alongside the mayor and the city's police commissioner. "We are conducting a full internal investigation into the events surrounding Senator Blake's arrest," Ramirez stated, her tone measured but firm. "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to transparency. Officer Stanton has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation." The reporter's questions came fast and furious. "Captain, does the department acknowledge that racial bias played a role in this incident? What changes will you implement to prevent this from happening again? Will the senator's proposed reforms have the department's support?" Ramirez sidestepped the most pointed questions, sticking to the script. But inside, she felt the weight of the scrutiny. The department had weathered its share of controversies, but this one felt different. Personal. The senator's status, combined with the irrefutable video evidence, had turned this into a national flashpoint. After the briefing, Ramirez retreated to her office, where Stanton waited, his posture stiff and defensive. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" he asked, his tone clipped. Ramirez gestured for him to sit. "I won't mince words, Mark. This isn't looking good for you." "I followed procedure," Stanton said immediately. "He resisted my questioning. I had every right to." "Stop," Ramirez interrupted, holding up a hand. "Just stop. You know as well as I do that this wasn't about procedure. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. And now, the entire department is paying the price." Stanton's jaw tightened. "So that's it? I'm the scapegoat?" "You're not a scapegoat, Mark. You made a choice, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice," Ramirez said, her voice firm but not unkind. "The investigation will determine your future here, but if I were you, I'd start thinking about what you've done and why." Stanton glared at her but said nothing. When he finally left, Ramirez exhaled deeply, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She turned her chair to face the window, watching as the sun dipped low over the city. Change was coming, but it would come at a cost. Blake's office was buzzing with activity that evening as his staff prepared for the next wave of interviews and strategy meetings. As Blake reviewed a draft of his proposed reform bill, his phone buzzed with a call from an unexpected number. He answered cautiously. "Senator Blake speaking." "Senator, this is Captain Ramirez." Blake sat up straighter. "Captain. What can I do for you?" There was a pause on the other end before she spoke. "I wanted to apologize again, personally. Not just for what happened, but for the culture that allowed it to happen. We have a lot of work to do, and I intend to start with my department. If there's any way we can collaborate." Blake's initial surprise gave way to cautious optimism. "I appreciate that, Captain. And I think collaboration is exactly what's needed. Let's set up a meeting." "Consider it done," Ramirez said. "And Senator, thank you for turning this into an opportunity for change, not just outrage." Blake's voice softened. "Thank you for reaching out. Change has to start somewhere, doesn't it?" As the call ended, Blake felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but moments like this reminded him why he had chosen this fight. For the first time all day, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Change was coming.